Phil, thank you very much for coming in.
You're welcome.
Pleasure to have you today. I thought it'd be interesting if you start by telling us a bit about who you are, what you do.
I've worked in the industry for 30 years.
Yeah.
I was a headhunter for quite a long time within the property and construction sector. I've been doing events management and conferences since 2004, 2005, so coming up 20 years now.
We're in the age of AI. It's inevitable. We're living it. It's in our phones, on our computers, everywhere we look at. Our decisions are being influenced and driven by AI. Property seems to a great degree to be immune from it. Not completely.
Really? Okay.
Or at least there's reluctance to it, to really adopt it, particularly compared to other sectors.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested in your perspective, because you really talk across the board. I'd be interested in your perspective as to why that is, and where do you see real growth and real adoption, and where do you see less so?
So 12 months ago, there was probably not one single session on AI that was badged as AI at UKREiiF. And bearing in mind, we have about 30 different stages, so there wasn't one single session.
Yeah.
This year, there's a lot more. And I guess what we've seen over the last 12 months is people have been talking about AI. But I hear lots of conversations about AI, but it was only when you and I met before Christmas and you actually put some real life examples on the table that I think myself and a lot of people in the room that have been talking about AI for 12 months started to think, oh, okay, that's how it can actually work. Because otherwise it's just been that rather exciting principle that scares people over 50 and excites people over 20, because of what's it going to do to the industry. But we often talk about the property and the construction sector as being one of the slowest sectors to embrace change and innovation. And I think it's compared to the one that's still doing it exactly as it used to do 50 years ago is the fishery industry. There's still ships going out there with nets catching fish.
But they have a better idea of where the fish will be, no?
Probably, but you think back to your average site and the process, BIM and digital twins changing things recently.
Yeah.
But are we any more productive as a result of the tech that we've used in the property and construction sector? I don't see that much evidence at the moment.
But methods of construction haven't really changed. We're using the same materials, it takes just about the same time periods. I think we're getting a lot better at managing our assets and managing the living buildings, understanding how they're being used, energy efficiency, ESG. I think there's a lot of work being done in that sector. But the silver bullet use cases, I think, are not there yet, where people see, oh yeah, this is a really good application, everyone does it, everyone adopts it, as has been the case in fintech, insurance, and others, where they've had really good applications of it. And if you think of the growth of the Revoluts and the Monzos and those things within fintech, they're very clear. In property, that hasn't happened. There's a few disruptors that come up around property management, around AVM for valuations, around how we manage our buildings, but there's massive opportunities around where do we build, what do we build, how do we price things, and I think that's where the opportunities exist.
What do we build? I would agree. I mean, I've just been to a later life living conference this morning.
For yourself or for you?
No, from a professional capacity. Okay, here we go again. This is the man who uses Facebook goes to later life living conferences. But so but what was interesting, the question was asked on stage, and again, not really answered. What are you using with regards to AI? What came out was the data that they could have used to help shape what housing a 60 to 65-year-old might want and thereafter. And I don't think they're using the data, because the question was asked, what are the key criteria? Now, okay, there's a big difference between a 55-year-old, 65, 75, at 80. And the average age of a person in retirement housing is 81 years of age. So that's quite a different mindset to a 60-year-old. But they're not using the data. The data's there, but they don't know how to access it, and they don't know how to use it to make the decisions to decide what to build, where to build, and how to build.
So we've worked with some of the biggest retirement house builders to define the potential success of a site, which is relatively straightforward to do from a machine learning perspective, where you look at all of their historical sites, you draw correlations to all of the local environmental contextual data, and then you say this site has been successful, this site hasn't. What made it successful, what made it less successful? And when you have enough data to do that, you can then say this site is more likely to be successful or less likely to be successful. But these are very small, isolated uses, which most retirement builders aren't doing. And I think the reason why they're not doing it is because there's such demand for the product, they don't really need to invest in it, because to a degree, whatever they build, they'll fill it. And I think that's probably true for great amounts of the property sector. Build in London, you'll sell it. Build retirement housing, you'll fill it eventually.
Eventually. I think that's the point. It's going to take you longer because it's not, people are not sort of waking up to the fact yet that that's what we need. We've got an aging population.
Yeah, and so you mentioned this year a lot of people are going to talk about AI at UKREiiF. Any particular sector?
No, I think it's fairly general. I'm quite interested to see where they take the conversation in terms of, I think there's a lot of people will go out of curiosity because they're not quite sure where it's going to impact them yet. And they're probably like me, they use ChatGPT a lot, and it's quite useful to be able to get yourself up to speed quite quickly on certain sectors and certain issues. That's what I use it for. But no real sectors. I mean, I think probably one, from a planning point of view, I think the real potential within the industry is the councils and the planning teams using AI to streamline the process.
I couldn't agree more. It needs automation. It takes far too long.
It does, for routine stuff. For grunt work that needs to be done because the boxes need to be ticked and the right documents need to be filed to allow more time to make the sensible planning decisions.
Absolutely, to give people the bandwidth to really think about planning. But it's interesting because when I speak to execs, they see planning as a major constraint to development. Because planning takes so long, because it's so inefficient, and because it's so human-driven, that it's very unpredictable.
The system's broken.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's the simple, the long and short, isn't it?
And so a lot of people say planning stifles innovation. And we worked with a planning consultancy to do sort of AI-driven planning applications and to do the phasing of sites. And it was interesting because the planning committee came back saying, well, we don't understand the comparables you used. And we go back and we say, well, we used millions of comparable data across the UK, etc. But it was too black box for them. They couldn't understand the logical flow from one comparable data to this, to that. And so then the applications were rejected. And I think until there's greater recognition of what AI can do and how it works, and literacy around the limitations and the potential of AI, adoption is going to be hard.
I think the private sector will jump on it quicker. Where I see the dearth of the lack of knowledge and exposure to AI is the public sector. And I did a conference with my local council in Cumberland recently, and I have a vested interest there because I'm a resident. So I'm interested to see their housing plans and what their economic plan is going forward. I spent a day with them without one reference to AI. And they're at the gathering data stage, because they need to consult, they need to validate the data. But wouldn't it be great if they understood how they could actually pull together all the data they need to have a cohesive economic plan, and they can work out exactly what the housing requirements are.
Which actually isn't that hard to do. From a machine learning perspective.
No?
All the data's there.
Have you had any engagement with councils, the public sector?
No, right. But part of it is it's a murky world. We don't really know how it understands.
Yeah.
It's driven by relationships, and the incentives are not profit-driven. It's hard to understand what the incentives are beyond staying on the council for as long as they possibly can. And so the KPIs around adopting AI are not there. A private sector enterprise, you say you can build faster, you can build better, you can build something that's better adapted to your clients, therefore higher revenue, lower cost of sale, all those sorts of things. They understand all of that.
Yeah.
When you go to local council, then it gets a lot more murky. It's like, what are you actually looking to optimize?
We need to get some councils to your session at UKREiiF.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to.
Oh yeah, we'll make a conscious decision to do that.
But I think the point you say is interesting, is about gathering the data. And I think lots of firms get stuck in that stage of gathering the data. And the data is never quite good enough to do AI stuff. And I think to a great degree that's a myth, that's a perception. For a lot of our clients, we don't use any of their data, we just use available market data to build the tools. If you're going to predict the market, if you're going to understand demographics and trends and things like this, I don't need your data. Often what we find is that the firms actually have enough data, even internal data available, and it's in a good enough state to be used. But it's siloed, it lives in a variety of spreadsheets and SharePoints and so on. The systems never talk to each other, so it's very hard to reconcile this data set from this data set and to merge them. And so we find actually now a lot of our work is getting firms AI ready, which is actually doing a maturity assessment of their data and saying, actually, A, you have quite good data, and B, you can generate some interesting insights with no machine learning, just some simple analysis. If you combine this data set with this data set, it will give you X, which is a really interesting metric for you to follow.
Yeah.
And that's where we find there's a lot of excitement, because suddenly at very low cost, they can start getting insights nearly immediately that will drive the decision making.
So do you see central government supporting this as well? Because I know DLUC are doing some work with councils on the planning process, not necessarily using AI, but I know from a technical point of view, they're looking to try and speed the process up. And they've got some examples of that with councils. But in terms of AI, are central government sort of
No,
backing
central
this?
government is busy trying to plan flights to Rwanda or save their skin in the next election.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah.
And I think to a great degree, central government knows they won't be here in a few months. And so I think that their focus is on other areas. Having said this, within departments, such as Department of Levelling Up and Housing and Communities, they've put together an AI group. They are trying to listen to the community. They're trying to start to think about what does it look like. But so it's within the civil servant class who are here for the longer term, where they can start thinking about these. And I think there is growing realization that they need to do something. They need to lead the way, that the UK risks losing innovation if they don't. We've seen quite a few UK property AI companies leave the UK and go to the US, where it's a much more receptive market, and it's a high volume of the sector.
So why is it more receptive?
I think more firms are more likely to take the risk to adopt it and see what happens. My experience in the UK is that most execs are not fearful or conservative, but wary. Pace of change is fast, so there's an element of thinking, if I wait a bit more, it will improve and will get cheaper. There's an element of saying, if my competitors aren't doing it and I don't have a fire under my seat, why change or why rock the boat? I think the companies which are asset heavy have recurring rental revenue coming in, and they often have 20-year leases or 10-year leases and so on. And so their time horizon is very different. I think the ones who are innovating the most are the service sector within property, because they need to innovate, otherwise they'll die and they'll be taken over by new disruptors who will do so for them. The walled garden is the REITs, is the asset-heavy users who need to rethink a little bit how they work, the ways of working, the operations, the efficiencies. Our ways of using offices are changing, our way of using real estate is changing, it's changing rapidly. So they need to be on the ball, they need to think about it, but it's not an immediate, I'm going to be fired next month if I don't do something about this. And I think that's where there's a lot of change.
I mean, the biggest challenge that we talk about across all the sectors is net zero.
Yeah.
And the big retrofit number that central government doesn't want to admit to how big the number is, and various people are throwing hundreds of thousands of £billion, trillion, I think, is the measurement that we're using. But again, that's all about.
But there's no real measurement.
There's no measurement, and we somehow need to capture the data in terms of working out, low-hanging fruit. But by 2050, not far off.
Yeah.
I'll have retired, you'll still be working.
I mean, like many of these days, they get pushed back, right? So 2050 becomes 2060, etc. I think one of the frustrations that the industry shares is there's no common measurement. I think there's lots of measurements out there. They all measure slightly different things in slightly different ways. And there's no commonality, which means very hard to benchmark. I know the RSCS, for example, from its valuation standpoint, is trying to apply brand discounts and green premiums to valuations and so on to reflect how good you are at ESG. The stumbling block is we don't actually know which measure to look for. EPC doesn't really do anything.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a flawed measure. That's probably the best we have so far, but it's only for residential, it's only at times of transactions. For commercial, it's harder. And a single measure like EPC hides many, many things. And so we have built actually AI tools that look at buildings, and we built up a menu of ESG activities you can do, such as a green wall, a grey water recycling system, an intelligent HVAC system, those sorts of things. And we try to calculate the return on investment of each. And these impact three metrics. They impact the willingness to pay of tenants. They impact the operational efficiency. So is it cheaper to run my building? And the capital value uplift. So will it go up in value? And as long as we can impact those three things, or any of those three things, then it's an easier conversation.
So I mentioned planning, I've mentioned retrofit.
Yeah.
From your perspective as the AI expert,
Yeah.
what do you think is the biggest game changer that AI is going to
Property management.
Property management.
I think it's a legacy industry that needs to change. I think there's a lot of anger and a lot of demand in the market for better property management. The challenge is property managers pass through all the cost of service charges. Service charges have ballooned in the last few years. They benefit from the lack of transparency in that because they can add profit margins, etc. into it. They don't have to answer awkward questions. So I think greater transparency in property management and the makeup of the service charges and so on. I think there's a lot of potential in the building management aspect of what lifts am I using, which lifts should I buy, which electric barriers are likely to fail. So the asset management perspective. I think the agency market should be disrupted. So residential and even the letting agencies. Yeah. I think that's a fairly old model that hasn't changed for a long time. We've built, I mentioned this last time we met, but we built AI tools Gen AI tools that interrogate leases, where you can throw in a whole bunch of historical leases, and then you have a chat box to start looking through that.
You need to link that in with the business trends, though, because the office that one single PLC has taken now, the landlord can look at that and can see the trends coming through and think, well, I'm actually going to split it into 20 leases now because I can make more money out of 20 SMEs coming through. And so they've got to be able to get that data to be able to feed it into that process.
But what's interesting is that leases are getting shorter. The requirement to changing up what an office is getting faster. We're using offices very differently. So for us, I think, piggybacking on you, but for us, things like events and things like this are far more important now than having desks. So we've privileged in building this office in having large spaces where we can host events, we can host a team and guests for a wide variety of different users and meeting rooms, rather than having desks, because we realize we're 160 people strong, we don't need 160 desks.
Particularly on a Friday.
Particularly on a Friday.
Yeah.
Or on a Monday.
Yes.
And so having adaptive users of property, those sorts of things, is really crucial. Okay. We were having a discussion here on saying, could we actually let out some of our desks on Mondays and Fridays? Because we have over 100 desks, we have 10 people coming to the office. It's a waste. And there are people out there in the market who want to have access to desks.
Yeah.
And it's an efficient use of our assets. We have a fixed overhead, we can't change that. Can we actually try to reduce or improve our income and reduce some of the variable costs? And this is where actually so in this building here, we have sensors that tell us how the building is used, that automatically heat up or cool down various rooms based on usage. turn on and off lights, all those sorts of things which you tend to do. But it gives us quite a lot of data as to how the building is used over a number of months and seasons. And these trends then inform how we drive our policies within the business. Do we force people back into the office? What days do they have to come back? How do we use the space when it's not there? Can we do events during those empty times? All those sorts of things. But we use a lot of data to do that, to inform those decisions.
And you know where to look for the data.
Yes.
I think half the problem is people don't know where to look for the data.
Yeah. And I think there's so much data that it's a bit paralyzing now. In the open market, you have so many providers of raw data that will give you thousands and thousands of data points. It's the combination of all of those, which I think, going back to where are the opportunities. Within buildings, we have lots and lots of sensors and IoTs. Within the city, we have lots and lots of data sources and data streams. And we have lots of providers that package up all of these data things. Very few players actually bring all of that together to generate really insightful decision-making insights. And I think that's where a lot of opportunities exist.
Yeah.
And I think the execs are still too reliant on insights being derived by lower ranks, the managerial ranks, to tell them what they need to know. They don't interrogate the data enough themselves. They're not sufficiently curious as to what AI can do for them to enable this. An example I gave you of using Gen AI to interrogate leases gets the execs much closer to the leases. They can now themselves interrogate it. Instead of sending an email to an intern saying, I want to know how many dentists are renting from me, and the intern comes back 2 weeks later with a graph. I think this is where the power of AI and data is to shorten that decision making, make it faster, make it better, and reduce the complexity that exists between the source of the data or the operation and the decision maker. I think there's enormous potential there.
Yeah, I think there's enormous potential. Take UKREiiF, take our business. Yeah. We're using basic.
Yes, I'm interested in your business
AI
too.
functions. Yeah, well, our business is an interesting one. I'm probably the wrong person to ask, but as we continue to grow, and it may well be 15,000 people in Leeds in 2025. That's what we predict. We've got the space. You know what we need to do to be able to get there. It'd be quite interesting to understand exactly how AI would assist on that journey, and then to take it to the next level.
I think it'd be interesting to see what do your customers want from UKREiiF in, not next year, but in 5 years' time, right? What's the makeup? Who will be there? Will you continue the same format of stages and so on? Will you have people attending virtually? I mean, there's lots and lots of potential.
Yeah, the virtual's interesting. Well, you're coming this year, you'll be in a better position to tell us what your thoughts are on that. The virtual, we looked at the virtual for year one, so 2022, we were still running the hybrid conference model. So we had 500 people in a room, and we had 150, 200 people at home watching it online. So as the host, I had to be mindful of the fact that there was a camera there, and there was 200 people behind it. It wasn't just to record what we were doing. So the interaction was slightly different. With so many stages at UKREiiF, we realised it was impossible to be able to do that with all the stages. So what did we do? Did we just do it for 3 stages? We decided not to. And then we've seen the hybrid conference fade. But a conference I was at yesterday, there were 800 people. Allegedly, there were 1,500 people watching it online. Quite interesting, but it was a tech conference, so it was a different audience. And that is potentially, hybrid UKREiiF in a couple of years' time could well be a way of really moving it up a notch or two.
But you are probably the UK's most conferenced man in terms of property. I think you go to just about everything. How do you see conversations evolving?
When we came back after lockdown, it was euphoria, just being able to see human beings. And we realized that, 18 months of Teams and online conferences was, it was, we weren't just shaking hands, we were hugging, know. So you're never going to get away from that. And even now we're bored of Teams, aren't we? And I'd almost rather take that, journey on the train to be able to have an hour.
I'm interested in the conversations you're hearing about the property sector. So you go to lots and lots of property conferences.
Yeah.
We've been to a couple together. How do you find execs talking about tech and property?
Guarded.
Is it evolving?
No, it's not. I don't think the conversations are different. And in terms of AI, I've heard lots of conversations over the last 12 months.
Yeah.
And I've deliberately gone to a number of discussions on AI because it's interesting.
Yeah.
And, it was the right thing to do because we're doing a lot more at UKREiiF. But I hear lots of conversations and lots of theoretical conversations. But
very few use cases.
But very few use cases.
Yeah.
And that's very few use cases that I think people in the audience understand. There's a couple of them which just going straight over our head. I was looking around at the body language and people were thinking, it sounds really cool, but it's not something that I understand what it will do for my business.
Yeah. And I think this is something that we've learned as well, is we've built a lot of really cool stuff that actually people think is cool but don't really engage with because they don't see the utility for them.
Yeah.
We've built tools that predict market movements more accurately than any surveyor, but only by 0.5% or 1% to 2%. It doesn't actually change markets, so it doesn't change your decision making. Where they're interested in is how do I derive an immediate benefit now, often in my operations. And we see the operational stuff is where there's real drive to change. ERP platforms, CRMs, all of these things. How do we get different data sources to speak to each other and tell us something new? And I think that's where there's a lot of potential.
Yeah, because tech has to be sustainable. So before lockdown, we had people bringing virtual reality headsets along to conferences to show off.
Yeah.
Really. And I think that's what it was. It was minority stuff showing off. I did so many webinars on virtual reality, augmented reality, AI. Clearly, I didn't know what I was talking about going back 3 years, but we don't hear those conversations anymore. And we envisaged, particularly when we were in the middle of lockdown, that we might see this virtual reality conference where you and I would have a headset on.
Yeah.
And we would meet in an online lounge. And because we'd be 3D and we'd look a little bit like what we actually look like, and our facial features might change when we met each other, that would be the future. And yet that's not a conversation we've had for the last 2 years, because
no, I agree.
We've reverted to type and we've gone back to the old-fashioned human interaction.
And I think that's a risk within the property sector as a whole, is we're reverting back to business as usual.
Yeah.
And we are reluctant to change. And I was speaking yesterday to an exec who was saying the biggest challenge for AI is the change management of the people. You can have a great tool that does lots of new things, but if you're changing people's jobs and how they do things, that gets scary, and they'll be reluctant immediately.
But there's a potential there. ESG, net zero. Since lockdown, we've got some really interesting job titles and some really interesting jobs, not just the titles, for the roles that people are doing. Head of ESG, head of net zero, head of sustainability and community engagement. These are not job titles that were around 3-4 years ago, and yet in the current climate, they're really interesting.
Yeah.
It's not contracts manager, program manager, head of future cities. It's all, we're thinking ahead. So I think we're making some progress there. But
so that's interesting. So crystal ball, 5 years time, UKREiiF, 2029 or 2030, let's say.
Yeah, okay.
Who's on stage? Which job titles are on stage? Which are the big attention grabber?
Now you've got me. Okay. Be interested to see where the conversation has evolved, because we're still talking about levelling up this year, and we were
Has
last
it died?
Year. It's probably
Government doesn't talk very much about it anymore.
No, and the concept is probably sound, but I'm sure if there's a change of government this year, it will have a new label. But it's all about devoting.
Yeah.
It's where do we devolve powers and funding. Yeah. And I think if Labour has been listening and they get into power, then that's an opportunity that they can really score some goals within the industry, I think, by doing that. But what would be on stage? I think we'll have we'll have more young people on stage. I think the conversation will be more tech orientated.
Yeah.
I mean, we had over 1,000 under 25s
That's really good.
UKREiiF last year, and there'll be even more this year, because for every 5 tickets that companies buy, we're saying you can have a free under 25. Because the under 25s, they will be the 30-year-olds in the timescales that we're talking about, and they will have amassed 5 years of knowledge of coming out to conferences that previously the chief exec or the business development director would go to, and they'll know what's required. And I think we'll see a younger age profile within the industry. It's been getting younger during my time. 1994, I joined the industry. I was in recruitment. If you were 50 years of age in 1994 and you were made redundant, you were going to struggle to get a job.
Yeah.
I'm 58 years of age, and I still feel as if I'm on a slight upward trajectory on the career, and I think back to 1994 and think, blimey, I'd have been scrabbling around then. So we've seen that change, but by 2030, I think you're going to see an awful lot of early 30-somethings leading some of these companies, because they'll have a fresh mindset.
Yeah.
They'll understand AI. They'll understand the role that tech will have to play in the industry, and that could be
And I think that's quite critical.
Could be a really interesting conference. Whether I'm still around, I might buy a ticket for that one. So.
Well, yes. Anyway, but I agree with you, and I think there's going to be a changing of the guard, and I think the changing of the guard will come up with they're born in that age, they live with it, or they'll be used to the phones and to everything else that does everything else for us. And so a lot of the concepts we're talking about in the commercial space, in the consumer space, will be very applicable to the property space. And I think the way we use property will have changed dramatically.
It will. I'd really like to
particularly
fast
commercial
forward.
Property.
Yeah, I'd like to fast forward to a high street discussion in 2030 to see what your average town and city centre looks like.
Which is interesting, because the death of the town centre has been much talked about in Herald, because we can shop online and get deliveries and so on. But actually there's a rebirth now of the town centre, because people want to walk into town, they want to go through local shops and those sorts of things. And I think there's an element of we want to feel connected to our urban fabric again, and not just live in a house and get everything delivered. And people are moving back to London because they want to be in London. We could work remotely, we could work anywhere in the country. But London is full again. And it wasn't a given post-COVID.
I've been walking around for the last 2 days, and there's 2 streams of traffic. There's the business people, there's the business community walking quite quickly, and there's the tourists enjoying the sunshine and the fact that we're well into the tourist season. And London's busy again. It's really busy. Which
is very encouraging, because there's very little void in the office market, which was predicted. And people are back in the office, and they're using tech, they're using data to better make decisions. And I think as the sector grows, as we better understand it, it will change our ways of working, but also how we behave within the built environment.
So UKREiiF in 2030, that's a conversation we need to have after this year's UK.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to, because I think it's, from my perspective, UKREiiF in 30 years, still the premier event in terms of real estate, but I think there'll be a lot more use cases of actually interesting stuff. A lot of the big changes which are underfoot now will have landed, and we'll be a lot more comfortable with the tech and the data that exists. And we'll move beyond the conversation of we need to gather the data to the conversation of what are the great things we can do with the data.
I mean, the journey to go there, just to go back to that, because it's another point that we're talking about. We know where we can grow next year. We know where we can grow in 2026. 2027, we have real potential within the site to be able to grow. But we've already got 33 pavilions. We don't want another 33 pavilions. Otherwise, you're going to turn up and think, well, I've got 66 pavilions that will all be running a program in addition to the rooms. Where am I going to go? So it actually needs to be something different. How do we grow UKREiiF using technology, using the preferences of people, to be able to get another 10,000 people there over the next 2 to 3 years without simply repeating what we're doing in terms of growth? And those are the interesting conversations we're having at this moment in time.
Presumably you do things like themed days and things like that.
There's all sorts of different things we can do. There are certain sectors that we'd like to see more of. We'd like to see more infrastructure discussions. So UKREiiF stands for, the UK Real Estate Investment and Infrastructure Forum, but we want more infrastructure there. So do we have an infrastructure pavilion, for instance? Off-site manufacturing, again, and the technology that one can use, sort of lump it all together in prop tech, if you like. But again, I could see some value in having a prop tech pavilion, where you can actually get some of the people there to demonstrate
what
the
they
tech.
do. Yeah.
So you can actually see it's not just a conversation, it's not just a video. And I think we'll see some of the innovators coming in talking to us about how that might work going forward. And that, I think, is going to make the next couple of years quite interesting as we set off down that journey and see what's possible. Yeah,
and I think you'll see tech will be front and foremost for everyone, but I think infrastructure and things like this will be important because they're massive users of tech, and a 1% improvement is billions of pounds.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the improvement would be. Okay, Phil, thank you very much.
Okay, Chris, you're welcome.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for the chat.